welcome very, very much to Conversations. Well, we're very pleased to welcome to the program this evening Dr. Ravi Batra. And Dr. Batra has written an extremely interesting book which is getting a great deal of attention here in the summer of 1987. And that book is called The Great Depression of 1990. And Dr. Batra, welcome very, very much to Conversations indeed. I wonder if you might share the idea of a Great Depression looming again, as you say in the beginning of your book. Most people living and walking about now have a hard time recollecting the Depression of 1930 in personal terms. But the idea of a Great Depression is an extremely frightening concept. And I wonder if and why it is that the idea occurred to you, and why it is you feel, even though so many of the indicators of the economy seem to be good, the Dow Jones is going well, and unemployment, interest rates, other things. I wonder what it is that gave you to believe that we have a Great Depression looming here in 1990, not only a depression, but a Great Depression of monumental proportion. What is there that makes you feel this, if you could, in a summary way, and then maybe we could talk some of the details?
Well, I have studied 300 years of U.S. economic history, and I found that there have been at least four major depressions in this country, and they usually occurred 60 years apart. In other words, every sixth decade there has been a big depression in the United States. And I found that each time there is a big jump in the concentration of wealth, and the concentration of wealth causes a big stock market rise, which creates a speculative bubble in the economy, and the bubble bursts, and when it bursts we have a depression.
And this has been universal throughout the history of our country? Or?
That's right, starting with 1780s, the next there was a depression in the 1780s, then another one in the 1840s. The next one occurred 30 years later in the 1870s.
That would be a 30-year cycle in that case, then.
In that case, it was a 30-year cycle. The Civil War brought about a very fast increase in the concentration of wealth. The Civil War occurred in the 1860s. As a result, there was a big jump in the concentration of wealth sooner than usual. So that created a big stock market bubble. The bubble burst in 1873, and we had a 7-year-long depression. It was called the Great Depression of the 1870s.
Indeed.
And then 60 years after that, we had another depression in the 1930s. Again, the same process. First, there is a big jump in the concentration of wealth in the 1920s, creating a big stock market bubble bursting, and then another depression.
Hasn't it been that in the New Deal and in the years of Franklin Roosevelt, in the depths of the Great Depression, that there's been so much thought and modern economic thought about the possibility of taking steps to ward off exactly the horrors of the Great Depression that were so well remembered? Government intervention in various ways, use of government capability to manipulate as necessary the economy, that many of the economists over this period of time since the Depression have been able to, in a certain sense, say, well, that will never happen again. And so many of the political leadership, much of the political leadership has said, well, we've established methods of safeguarding the banking system and so forth that would make it so that a depression would not happen again. And so much of the attention has been directed at that end. Has that all been in vain in terms of the attempts to underpin the economy in a way to prevent the possibility of another Great Depression such as we had in the 30s?
Well, that's what the economists said each time the depression happened.
Is that right?
That we took steps after the previous depression, so we can't have another depression now. That's what they said in the 1920s. In fact, the most well-known economist of the 1920s was Irving Fisher from Yale. And a week before the stock market crashed, he said, the stocks are on a permanently high plateau. That was on October 17, he said that. And October 24, 1929, the stock market crashed, and he lost $10 million himself. So that's what we used to say in the 1920s. We now have the Fed.
Yes.
See, the Fed was established in 1914. 1914.
Right.
So the economists say in the 1920s, we now have the Fed, so another depression is impossible. Well, what really happens is that the government learns its lessons from the depression. So each time a depression occurs, the government says, we are not going to let another happen.
Yes, and the economists, the professional.
And the economists, the same thing.
By and large, if you were to take a poll now, the economists in our United States and world economy would probably say, is there likely to be another depression? They would probably mostly vote no, would they?
That's right. In fact, 99% will say no.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens? The reforms which the government undertakes right after the depression become obsolete 60 years later because of the extreme concentration of wealth.
Now, this is something that usually has not brought up in the factoring so much as
Nobody
you
ever,
underpin it. Yeah.
Nobody ever has talked about the importance of, well, I would say nobody, not nobody, but the established economists, the well-known economists have ignored the key variable. The variable which really matters, and that is the concentration of wealth. Concentration of wealth provides the foundation on which stands the rest of the structure of the economy. So economists keep talking about the structure, ignoring the foundation which has cracks. So the result is that every 60 years the reforms which were undertaken in the past have become obsolete. Let me give you an example of the reforms which have become obsolete. Now, we learned our lesson in the 1930s, and we said banks should not pay interest on checking accounts in the 1930s. They were paying interest in the 1920s, and then in the 1930s we said banks should not pay interest on checking accounts because that means the banks cannot let their money sit idle in the deposit. If they are paying interest, they can't let it sit idle, which means they have to chase the borrowers.
Yes,
They have to run after the borrowers.
That has happened.
That is happening again. And when the banks have to run after the borrowers, you are certainly asking for trouble. You are asking for a very shaky banking system. Now, the Congress did learn its lesson in the 1930s, banned this practice at that time, but now we have permitted the banks to pay interest again. So that regulation of the banking system is already obsolete now.
Now, what are the forces that lead us to repeat the errors of the past, such as that, if is the main thrust of one of your books? What is the process that leads us to repeat?
I think it's a memory loss. The last time the depression occurred was 60 years ago. We did not identify the true cause of the depression at that time. The true cause was the concentration of wealth, and we said, no, that's not the, we talked of something else. Fortunately or unfortunately, in this case, there was a Second World War. It brought us out of the depression. So we thought, well, we are out of the woods. But we never paid attention to the real cause, which was the extreme concentration of wealth. And so now we're making the same mistakes. In 1981, there was a big tax cut favoring the rich. That caused a big jump in the concentration of wealth. Right after that, you see a big rise in the stock market. It always happens. Whenever the rich get richer at a very fast pace, the stock market shoots up.
Now, the tax cut in 1981, and it's interesting, Walter Heller had advised a tax cut to Mr. Kennedy that seemed to have worked well in the 60s and so forth, or perhaps having different sociological implications and so forth. But the idea of a tax cut had been, in a certain sense, across the board to many of the citizens, and the general idea was to encourage the private sector, and the general supply side premise that Mr. Laffer and Jude Winniski and some of the others were saying was that this incentive would increase investment capability for us to expand the economy that would more than pay for itself in terms of lost revenue and so forth. Was a general philosophy that was being implemented at that time.
There's nothing wrong with cutting taxes. You know, big government becomes quite inefficient at a certain point, but cutting taxes for the poor and the middle class is one thing, and then cutting taxes for the rich is something else.
But in 81 they did cut taxes for the middle. They cut taxes for the middle class and for some of the poor
what they say.
As well.
That's what they say. But the majority of the tax cut, the major portion of this went to the rich.
Okay.
Very large portion of the tax cut went to the rich, and so who already have a lot of money, and they don't know what to do with it, so they speculate with it.
The rationale being that if there's a tax cut, the rich are more likely to invest money because they have excess money to invest. If there's a tax cut that favors the rich, there will be more money available for investment purposes to allow the private sector to heat up or to be able to gain greater production.
That was the rationale. Yes, that was the rationale. But it didn't happen that way. They started putting money in the stock market rather than into productive investments. And that's exactly what happens whenever there is too much concentration of wealth. The rich, I have found, the wealthier you are, the greedier you become.
Is that a fact? You think that has something to do with human nature?
Human nature, I think.
We want to talk about that.
Yes, it is something to do with human nature. These depressions are caused by human nature, not by institutions. Institutions can change over time. You can reform the institutions, but the human nature doesn't change that fast, if at all. So I found in history that whenever there was a big jump in the concentration of wealth, right after that you had a big stock market bubble.
Speculation.
And the bubble burst in the end. The bubble would usually take about 7 years to peak. Then it would burst. After the bursting, you had the depression. So now we are in the bubble stage. We have been in the bubble stage for the past 5 years, and in fact, I made this forecast in writing in some articles that the stock market mania will occur because of the tax cut of 1981.
You've had an incredibly good track record in terms of making projections, not only about the economy, but broader questions as well, which is part and parcel of the reason I think your book is being taken so seriously by so many serious people, even though it seems in a certain sense to be outside the mainstream of economic thinking. And so that's important that you've been able to have your finger to the pulse. I wonder if I come back to this question, which you've identified as a major question in terms of the cause of depression, being the concentration of wealth.
That's right.
We want to talk in some specific terms about the concentration of income and the concentration of ownership of assets or wealth. There's two separate classifications of that. But I wonder if I could ask you, why is it, if this is in your estimation such an important factor, that it has been so largely overlooked by mainstream establishment economists as they try and deal with the questions of long-term growth of the economy?
Well, there are several reasons. One is that the political power and the economic power is in the hands of the rich. And few people want to offend them lest their own pockets are picked.
Despite the fact we have a supposed politically democratic system that should be able to find
look at the government. Look at the government. All the cabinet ministers, or most of them anyway, have been multimillionaires.
Yeah, so even the senators and so forth.
Right, and they are the ones making policies for the poor and the middle class.
It's always been so?
Yes, it has always been in this country, in America, because America has always has been in what I call the age of acquisitors.
Yes, we want to talk about that. Sakar's philosophy, but yes.
Yes. So few economists or politicians want to really offend the rich. And secondly, the rich people also provide these distinguished university chairs, and then economists. There are some economists who talk about concentration of wealth, but they don't become popular.
They don't become popular talking that way, even though this could have a significant role in trying to understand, even in an academic or a theoretical sense.
That's right. Even in the academic world. I have published articles in some of the most prestigious journals in economics.
Yes.
And you will find in the past 30 years, less than 1% of space devoted to the economic impact of wealth concentration.
Interesting. And yet, in your estimation, this is the single most important indicator of this tendency.
You find that the economic forecast, the forecasts of all other economists, are wrong. In fact, they keep changing them every 3 months. Why they are wrong? Because they are ignoring the fundamental cause of all the economic troubles, which is wealth disparity. I have not ignored that point. In fact, I have looked at it extensively and made forecasts based on my own theory, which takes into account this factor, and as that's why not a single forecast of mine has been wrong so far.
Yeah, that is really something. Not a single forecast. You've been right on the money in each of these. And I wonder, maybe we could outline the degree to which this concentration of wealth or ownership has come to occur and what the historical trend has been. It peaked in 1929, it got up to, maybe you could share what some of those figures are.
Well, what happens is that there is a cycle of the concentration of wealth.
Okay.
It peaks every 60 years, then creates a stock market bubble. Eventually, there is a depression when the bubble bursts. When there is a depression, many fortunes are wiped out, so concentration of wealth falls.
I see.
Then takes another 60 years through inheritance and through transference to peak. Then another bubble, another depression, and so on.
And so, to what degree are we? Is the wealth concentrated in the United States?
So, in 1929, we had the worst concentration up to that time. 1% of the population owned 36% of wealth in 1929.
1% owned 36% of productive capital, of assets or wealth, right?
Right, which means stocks, bonds, commercial real estate, gold, jewelry, of all these assets, they owned 36%.
And these changes occurred glacially. I mean,
very
the changes
slowly,
go very slowly.
60 years, as I said, to peak. So then there was a massive depression, so concentration of wealth started falling.
Yes.
And it kept falling, in fact, up to about 1973, 74. And at that time, there was a big jump in the oil price. So many people became multimillionaires overnight. So it started rising at that time.
I see.
And then the tax cut of 1981 gave it a further boost. So now 1% of the population owns 34% of wealth.
It's come back up to 34, very near to the figure it was in 1929.
Why do you think there is a big stock market bubble? Because we are very close to that historically high concentration of wealth ratio that appeared in 1929.
The stock market bubble being speculative investing, that the very rich with a great deal of cash available are ready to become speculative as it relates to the market. And that creates a speculative bubble, as you say. Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
See, it's a human nature that when you become rich, you like to take bigger risks.
Yeah, you're able to.
You're able to, and so you can afford to gamble money in the speculative markets. So when wealth is concentrated, that's why there is a big stock market bubble.
And it isn't all ships rise, as they would like to say, because a great deal of the American citizenry has suffered in living standard and so forth, even in real terms. As this concentration of wealth has accumulated in the upper reaches of the economy. Could we differentiate in terms of that between, let's say, the percentage of people who own wealth and income? You could measure income, the amount of income. You had figures in the book that you quoted that there was a concentration of income in the upper classes, but then there was an even higher concentration, whereas 1% of the population owned something on the order of 90 or more than 90% of the population in terms of assets.
Yeah,
it really is highly concentrated.
Yeah, wealth concentration is
ownership of the means of production in a certain sense is highly concentrated at a relatively small group of people within the American economy. Is becoming more so.
Right. The concentration of wealth is much more important than the concentration of income, which is not as bad as the wealth disparity.
Wealth being largely, corporate and other kinds of stock and bonds.
The total amount of wealth in the country is $12 trillion, whereas GNP is $4 trillion. So naturally, what is the 12 trillion concentration is much more important than the concentration of the 4 trillion. So that's why my emphasis is not on concentration of incomes, which also is highly concentrated, but on concentration of wealth, because wealth is 3 times the amount of GNP.
And it's become through time it's become more so.
Yes.
And at the time in which you and I sit and talk, it's becoming, that's the tendency.
It is rising rising every day because the stock market is rising.
There's an old time saying, them that has gets, or the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, or something of that sort. That tends to be the situation as we see it now. We look out on a nation with homelessness and other kinds of problems and so forth of the underclasses increasingly.
That's a real curse on the economy, because that kind of situation leads to depression.
And this happens, this tendency of the economy to move in that direction, you said before, is an inevitable result of the selfishness or greediness inherent to human nature?
Yeah.
Which might begin to bring us into the feelings of, or the philosophy of Mr. Sakar, which I know you have seen as an inspiration and a mentor to yourself.
That's right. It's the human nature that the wealthier you become, the greedier you are. I've found that the poor as a percentage of their incomes, give a lot more for donations than the rich people or the rich corporations.
Even though they have the disposable income to do it, they do not.
Right.
It's interesting. That seems to be the case here in the United States. Around the world, is it?
Around the world, I think.
How do we account for this, do you think? Or how?
Well, I told you that this is human nature, that the human mind wants unlimited happiness, wants to be happy all the time. And if the mind thinks that happiness is coming from wealth, then it wants unlimited wealth. And so that's why what explains Ivan Boesky or all the insider trading things that have come to light recently, that these people have multi-millions of dollars and they still want more. And that's the human mind, which wants more and more if it has already more.
I see. The more they have, the more they want, but with that selfishness or greediness, let's say, is it inherent to the genetic structure of the human species? Would this be characteristic of people who are not very wealthy? If they could be wealthy, they would be, and that it's an inherent characteristic of the human species, as it were, greedy and selfish, and has to be guarded against in terms of social policy and so forth, in your estimation, and is not, or at times
it's not being done
under particularly a capitalist model. Is that fair to say, or not?
Well, I think even in communism, under communism, the human nature is the same everywhere. It is just that the social policy has to look at the good effects of wealth inequality and the bad effects. And I found that in history, whenever 1% have more than 25% of wealth, then we are in the troubled zone. But until that point, the economy functions smoothly.
Yeah, it is interesting. We were taking account of the concentration of wealth in the United States, but this would apply to the world society?
Everywhere.
Every world. There tends to be a concentration of ownership among the societies of the world, and a leadership class of maybe 5% that tends to emerge in each of the societies as they evolved throughout history?
Throughout history, and in today's world, we find that countries which have higher concentration of wealth are the poorest in the world. Countries like India, Brazil.
They have the highest concentration
of wealth. Argentina, England. In England, 1% of the population owns 50% of wealth.
My Lord.
You can see their economy has been stagnant for the past 50, 60 years.
This figure of an extreme concentration of wealth among those that have, or the dictum, those that have get, or those that have get, is that perhaps built into the fact that, particularly in the modern experience with technology increasingly becoming responsible for production in a ratio with human labor or human activity, in ratio to technology, it's inherently such that the people who have credit to buy self-liquidating assets that will pay for themselves in a reasonable period of time, the logic of business finance, is available to those that have. So it's logical that there would be a concentration of wealth among those who have ownership of the means of increased production, which is technologically based.
Right.
So it would be inevitable there would be that result.
Mostly because of inheritance. See, civilizations which are very old tend to have very high concentration of wealth because of inheritance. And that's the case with India, Brazil, and Argentina, and also England. Whereas in the U.S., it is not as high as in England because U.S. is relatively young. But still, it has jumped to quite a big figure. In the U.S. history, I found that as long as you are below that 25% figure, you're all right. But the moment you start crossing that figure, then you have inflations, high unemployment, and ultimately depression.
And you'll have that no matter how large the the pie, as it were. It doesn't affect, it's the concentration of the wealth that leads to the speculative boom and so forth. And that the fact that the wealthy are becoming ever more wealthy and owners of the means of production increasingly means that the lower classes necessarily must suffer, do not have the credit in order to get by in life. They begin to borrow speculatively in order just to finance their own living and so forth. And it's being taken at the expense of the underclasses then, inevitably, even though the economy may be expanding and it's not an all ships will rise kind of philosophy that will work.
See, in the 1920s, the United States was far richer than what it was in the 1860s or 70s.
Yes, yes.
And yet there was a depression in the 1930s, and then there was a depression before that in the 1870s.
Yes.
So just because the entire economy is rising, it does not mean that you can't have depression as long as you have extreme concentration of wealth.
No matter how big the pie, right?
Right, because this is because of the human nature, that the more you have, the more you want.
That's human nature, and something that we're not going to be able to get around. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about Sakar, if we could. He's somebody that's a mentor to you, and he has a broad historiography of the reading of human society, where in large cycles it goes through periods of 4 basic types of human beings being prevalent. Maybe you could touch on it, because that is important to your unique sense of the time and to your unique forecasting. Maybe you could touch on that if you would, please.
Well, it's my teacher's philosophy of history, which has been the inspiration to my ideas. The idea that concentration of wealth is bad for the health of the economy actually comes from my teacher, Mr. P.R. Sarkar. Now, but he is concerned with cycles which apply to all civilizations.
And over a long historiography, really.
That's right. He's interested in the concept of historical determinism, saying that history repeats itself in terms of cycles. And so he says that there are 4 major classes in every society.
4 types, as it were, of people.
Of 4 types of people, and therefore 4 types of classes in society. You have the class of the warriors, or the military. Then you have the class of the intellectuals, and among intellectuals he includes everybody who does his job through thinking,
including the theologians and
including the priesthood, theologians, and even the attorneys or the doctors, because more brain work is involved than physical work, which is the case with the warriors. So he has a class of warriors, class of intellectuals, then he has the class of acquisitors, the people who try to save as much money as possible so that through that savings they can hire others and manage the economy and so on. In the class of acquisitors you have the bankers, the merchants, the moneylenders, industrialists, businessmen, and so on. And landlords, very important. And then finally you have the class of the physical or the unskilled worker or the unskilled laborer.
The laborers, those 4 main groups, and there has been an ascendancy of those groups in a historical cycle sense, where one would follow upon the other as being the prevalent social power, as it were, within civilization.
We find that in every civilization, first there was the age of the warriors. That is, power went from the laborers to the warriors.
The laborers being sort of an undifferentiated kind of anarchy or something?
All civilizations were primitive at first.
Yes.
Human mind was at a very low level of consciousness, so we were all unskilled workers at that time. And from them came out the warriors who started the empires and big states, and so that was the start of civilization.
And that was their main thrust and
main contribution.
Raison d'etre of their consciousness, their unique consciousness. Right, okay, all right.
So we find that each civilization is first ruled by the warriors, then comes the rule of the intellectuals. By rule I mean the dominance of the intellectuals.
The dominance of their social influence. And political influence.
Political influence. After that comes the rule of the acquisitors. The acquisitors create so much materialism in society that there is too much crime, lawlessness, family breakdown, and drug addiction, and so on, that in the end people are fed up and they overthrow the acquisitors and start a new order, new social cycle.
Which would be the laborers again.
Well, acquisitors tend to create a society of laborers towards their end, and then these laborers revolt, and out of that revolution comes the warriors come back again.
Eventually they do, after a period of quasi-anarchy or something under the laborers, which tend to be differentiated and so forth. And in your estimation, as far as the United States is concerned, within this broader sweep of human history, and this cycles would have certain dynamic apart from individuals, or it's a certain kind of deterministic reading of human history and so forth. But you felt that the United States was founded in era, or in most of its birth or its history as a republic, it has been under inquisitors.
That's
that
right.
has been the principal
United
leader.
States has not seen any other age.
And that you call this age that we're in now the Inquisitors cum laborers, that we're at the end of the Inquisitor phase in your estimation, and this Great Depression would signal the end of that era of things, as it were?
That's right. The Great Depression of the 1990s, I think, will bring about an end to the age of Inquisitors. And therefore we will have, right now we have monopoly capitalism.
Yeah.
And this monopoly capitalism will give way to what I call mass capitalism or industrial democracy. Some other people call it employee stock ownership, etc. But
that's interesting.
I would rather call it mass capitalism, where stocks and bonds are distributed among white-collar workers, among blue-collar workers, and their representatives together manage the factories.
Well, that would be part of an economic order which, in a certain sense, is it Prout?
Yes, that's an economic order, again, envisioned by my teacher, P.R. Sarkar, and he calls it Prout.
Prout, sorry, yeah.
P-R-O from progressive, U from utilization, and T from theory. So he says it's a progressive utilization, and he uses the word progress because it means it is coming from human evolution, social evolution, so it's a progressive society.
And it would grow out of, it would grow to where there would be an expansion of ownership, a greater equity than, as it were, as opposed to the concentration of wealth you said is a prime cause of the fluctuations historically in our economy and so forth. But that would be part and parcel of what would seem to be like, in a certain sense, I don't want to use the term loosely, but an ideal or an appropriate way for a society to be organized for long-term growth and security and so forth?
Well, if we don't do anything right now, if we don't control this concentration of wealth, and if we don't control the stock market euphoria, then the depression is going to come in the 1990s. And that's why I have the title of the book, The Great Depression of 1990. So we're going to have the depression.
Not just a depression, a Great Depression.
A Great Depression,
which is,
lasting for 6 to 7 years possibly. Then people will realize, yes, indeed, the extreme concentration of wealth brought us down so much, brought us down so far. Then they will take measures to put a restraint on this wealth disparity. And one of the measures to put a long-term restraint is what I've called mass capitalism, or the widespread ownership of stocks and bonds. That
would be one of the results of that. Would it be possible for there to become a widespread ownership of the means of production, as it were, stocks and bonds and major corporations and so forth, without the trauma? And the trauma of a major and Great Depression is horrendous to contemplate.
Yes,
I mean, not only in this country but around the world.
Around the world.
Is it possible that there could be the achievement of these conditions, as you say, expanded ownership, either through there are stock employee plans, other kinds of relatively small but meaningful attempts in that direction? Is it possible for there to be a reformation of this system in that direction without suffering the Great Depression?
If we can do that, then we will certainly prevent the depression. But whether or not it's possible, well, we have to start a grassroots movement, a movement towards this end, and that's what. That's why I am now more confident than ever before that we can stop this coming depression, because
you're confident that we can stop?
Yes, I'm confident, because earlier when I made the forecast of the depression in 1980, nobody was paying attention at that time. Now many economists see the symptoms of the coming depression, and they are talking about it too.
Increasingly. John Kenneth Galbraith has talked about it. Felix Royten has taken great exception, particularly with the international monetary situation and the need maybe for a new Bretton Woods or some sort of pattern.
And even
but increasingly responsible people are saying this is something that could happen. Yes,
even the economics editor of Wall Street Journal says that we possibly will have another depression.
Mr. Malabry.
Right.
Alfred Malabry.
Right. And remember, I said this in 1980.
Yes.
And nobody believed me at that time.
Nobody at all would have taken it.
Right. So it took me seriously. So I had to write a book about it and how we can also prevent it. Now people are listening. All my forecasts have come true. And I made the prophecies to gain the public trust. And I think as more and more people read this book, they will have confidence in me, and then I and them together, we can start a grassroots movement and convince the politicians that something has to be done at this time to stop this coming depression.
It's very discouraging to think of that now, given the fiscal policy of Mr. Reagan's administration, the mindset of the nation, its leadership by and large, the euphoria, the galloping Dow, and some of these other kinds of things. It's a little bit discouraging to think major change would be able to be incurred, because 1990 is only a couple of years off.
I know, but see, nothing big, nothing great is achieved without work, without sacrifice, and without hard work. I think stopping this depression, to me, is the noblest cause of this century.
Yeah, well, it might well be, in a sense, that the depression, if you take a longer, if I may, the Mr. Sakar and the long historiography and the taking a long sweep of human history, and maybe it goes back a couple 100,000 years that humanity first appeared, and we've now reached the point where a good deal of that technology that we have outed from our own consciousness into the environment is destructive in a new way.
Yes.
It might be that we're capable of obliteration of a habitat that could support the human species for the first time in the history of the evolution of consciousness, so that it might be a major point, and if an economic downturn or a major depression could well lead to the conditions that could, perhaps could lead to conditions that would lead someone to feel out of desperation the need to go toward unleashing atomic, hydrogen, chemical, and bacteriological warfare.
Yeah,
so that built on top of the human suffering that would occur in a normal economic depression was this whole arena of destructive capability that is now Promethean-like in our hands.
Yeah,
you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand what you mean. If there is a depression, could that lead to a war?
Yes,
that's what you're saying. Well, I hope not, first of all.
Right.
And I don't think so, because the nuclear terror is stronger. It creates so much terror in everybody's mind.
Yes.
And I don't think another war is likely or is possible. And it certainly won't be a solution to the problem of depression, unlike the Second World War that took us out of the previous depression.
Yeah, in a sense, it makes it difficult for that emerging warrior thing to be able to find a
well, that's why I think that this time
lead role.
This time I think, therefore, there will be genuine economic reforms. Nothing else will bring us out. So we will have to introduce genuine economic reforms, such as the employee stock ownership plans, such as Prout that I've talked about in the book. Nothing, no such thing as a war will bring us out.
Yeah, I wonder if you could tick off in your own mind what kind of economic reforms that you might be able to see over the little bit longer haul, and maybe even in the short term, that could be addressed by policymakers and so forth, and that you'd like to see policymakers address. There's a question of maybe some sort of a short-term and quickly enacted wealth and tax, or tax on wealth, or some of the things that you could see that might be able to be done to ward this off in the couple of years that we have.
Some things we can do right away, and we should do right away. The Prout system that I've talked about is a very long-term plan, and we can wait for that. But I think we should do something right now to immediately control the concentration of wealth and cool down the stock market euphoria. One measure I suggest is to impose an average 5% wealth tax on that 1% of the population, which now has about $4 trillion of wealth. They earn around 10% return on it every year, which means they earn about 400 billion return on that. Just take half of that, 200 billion.
They wouldn't miss it, huh?
They won't even miss it, because they have 4 trillion.
They have more than they could possibly have, you would think.
You would think, at least, So collect about 200 billion a year from the 1% of the population, and use that to eliminate the budget deficit and slowly start retiring the debt. In about 10-12 years, the government debt will be eliminated, and then you can repeal the tax if you like.
Now, in order to get that kind of thing, you would have to have all those lobbyists and people, sycophants and others who are supported by those leadership elements to go along with a system that could be seen in the short term to be against their interests.
That's right. It's not, even though it is in their interest also,
in the long term
it is in their interest also to stop the depression. They would still think that it is against them, and that's why I'm talking about starting a grassroots movement, where I can tell the public, here all my forecasts have come true, even though so many people doubted them. And if we don't do anything, then the depression forecast will also come true. So come, help me, and we can then together stop the depression.
Are you, I don't want to say sanguine, but are you at all optimistic that such a course could emerge, given the national psychology now? And
well, I'm doing my very best.
Yes,
I am doing about 4 or 5 radio shows every day, and talking to all sorts of media and press, and I genuinely want to stop this depression because, as you said yourself, none of us really can even imagine what a depression is like.
It would be such a horror. There are some people who remember that just vividly themselves, and then the compound interest on that, as it were, and as it redounds back through the whole world economy, would be horrendous. And in some of the developing world and so forth, tremendous human suffering, and that kind of thing is something to be obviously attempted to be avoided. Is this, we're talking largely about the American economy. The American and the international economic order is increasingly interconnected. This would be something that would be born perhaps in the United States, but it would have international ramifications that would affect all the world, including the communist socialist world. And what would be the likely outcome of the dynamic between a socialist-oriented economy or socialist-oriented world, such as the Soviet Union and so forth? How would it relate? How would it affect that? And what would be the long-term geostrategic, geopolitical, and economic relationships between, let's say, the capitalist world and the socialist world?
Well, I've studied all these questions, and I think this time the depression would start from Japan. Their stock market is even in a bigger mania. Much bigger bubble is building up in Japan than in the United States. So I think the bubble will burst first in Japan.
The bubble burst in the stock market, and then it will come
then it spreads.
But then it would also affect the financial institutions,
the banks,
which would bring it into a real depression.
Right, industries. There'll be a tremendous amount of unemployment, and that's why I tell the people, all right, let's first try to stop the depression. And if we can't, let's prepare for it. And I have about 25 pages of advice in the book.
To the individual investor.
To the individual investor, to the individual worker. And it's a down-to-earth, practical advice. It is not going to make anybody multimillionaire, but it will tell us how to protect our assets from the coming crisis. I tell the public, avoid real estate, avoid investments which make you illiquid, and stock market will keep rising for another 2 years, and if you are in the market, stay there for that time, and then get out of the market in 89, middle of 89, get into gold coins and cash and so on.
Gold coins and cash in order to have survival through this 6-7 year period.
Precisely.
Get rid of real estate because that's likely to become devalued and so forth.
Right.
Not buy until after 1990 when prices...
Precisely. It will depreciate a lot. But don't worry about your own homes because Congress will protect the homes.
These measures that have been acted, the $100,000 on bank accounts and other kinds of things that have been done to try and underpin it, the attitude of the federal government in terms of taxation during a recession, they would not go as Mr. Hoover had done and so forth, and there seems to be wisdom. Simply in your mind, given the current drift of things, won't serve those things that so many of the economists put such faith in.
I said that, that 60 years later, because of extreme concentration of wealth, all the previous reforms become obsolete. The FDIC and FSLIC, they have about $20 billion to insure $1 trillion of deposits. Now, how are they going to help us? The government is broke already. All the reforms which we undertook in the New Deal in the 1930s, they are useless now because the government cannot help us anymore.
You can only go so far with the government. Well, Social Security or other kinds of income distribution, a major factor in terms of the economy, those things would hold and so forth. So
they will have to cut back on these
They would have to cut back, but the system could hold. It wouldn't be a defaulting on that system.
They could. I don't think
that would be a countervailing tendency in terms of underpinning the social fabric of the society.
Well, I think they will honor their commitments to Social Security, maybe trim it a bit, cut it down a bit. They will also try to honor their commitments to depositors, but again they may have to trim them down, cut them down from 100,000 to maybe 40 to 50,000, and even less than that. They will try all these things. They'll try their best to honor their commitments.
You've been talking before about, particularly with Mr. Sakar and this long historiography and this sort of thing leading to that. People in the 1930s, as you said, thought we had reached a point where we were out of the woods, as you put it, out of the cycle, having necessarily bringing depression and so forth. The establishment of the idealized system of widespread ownership among the peoples of the world and so forth of the means of production. Can you see, if you were to look and project somewhat ahead, perhaps, and let's say we get past this or we emerge out of it, can you see us breaking out of this cycle of things, as it were, so that the errors of our grandfathers need not be repeated, or that we would reach a point at a certain times in terms of the relationship of individuals to the material reality in the world and so forth, where we could have long-term security or long-term appropriate organization of the economic order so that these things would not avail? If you understand what I mean. Could we be coming to the end of a historical period that might have begun when first the human society began? Or are we at a major break point, or extending out into the longer term?
It's a very simple argument that I have. Destroy the cycle of the concentration of wealth, then you destroy the cycle of depression. As simple as that. Mm-hmm. Because the cycle of the concentration of wealth causes the cycle of the depression. Mm-hmm. So this Prout system that I've talked about, in which the ownership of means of production is widespread, that will destroy this cycle of the concentration of wealth.
Is it going to destroy the vehicles for wealth production, though? I mean, would we destroy the means by which increased material wealth and benefit of technology and material betterment, which most of the world seems interested in, still in a?
No, it won't destroy we don't want to destroy we don't want to destroy the wealth itself. Mm-hmm. We want to destroy the concentration of wealth.
Yeah, but by destroying the concentration of wealth, would you destroy the institutions and the means of production that in themselves create wealth?
No,
I suppose many people would argue.
In fact, wealth will be created at a faster pace because individuals, workers will have a stake in their own industries, they will have a pride in their own industries, so that they will work harder. Productivity will rise, so the growth rate in the economy will actually rise when with the Prout system.
Do you think that some people have defined economics, if I may, I don't want to speak philosophically, but some people have defined economics itself as the allocation of scarce resources. Do you think that with given quantum leaps in terms of technologically augmented productive capability and so forth, there's robotics on the horizon, the semiconductors, other kinds of things that are able to do increasingly, we're able to get, in a certain sense, the standard of living over the long haul has been increasing, or can be seen to be so, for a good deal of the world population. That's something to be lauded. Do you think we'd ever reach the point in terms of human society, maybe looking out a number of decades or something, where the fundamental concept of scarcity itself would become something that we could see collectively to have overcome? Or is that reaching for a kind of world order that is not possible to be foreseen?
No, I don't think...
there'd be enough, a general sense of there being enough among the peoples of the world, so that the scramble for the greed and the scramble for the scarcity and so forth might be able to be, we might be able to transcend that which we call human nature, or that aspect of human nature which seems to be selfishness and greed, built out of insecurity.
Well, I think I think the resources of the world will always be limited, because by nature these things are finite. But we need a system in which the fundamental necessities of every family are satisfied. Mm-hmm. The wage rate, the minimum wage rate is high enough that everybody's minimum needs are satisfied. Minimum needs being food, clothing, shelter, education, Medicaid, and so on. Once we have done that, then the responsibility of the society is over. You first provide a minimum wage to everybody such that your minimum needs are satisfied, and that's the basic concept of Prout.
Suppose you had not only a minimum wage, as you put it, but that's having the individual family unit or individual depend upon a labor relationship to production, that they had an ownership stake that yielded dividends or something enough to guarantee their
that is
the necessities
on top.
of life.
That is on top. You have minimum wage guaranteeing the necessities, and on top, if you have ownership, then you share the profits also in accordance with your productivity.
No, but the basic needs, as you see, would be able to come out of the wage relationship
minimum
they would have
wage.
to the to the standard of...
Yes. In my system, in my proud system, every worker gets a minimum wage, and then he gets to share the profits in accordance with his productivity.
Everyone gets the minimum wage, though, and so
Yes.
forth. Yeah, I was going to just say, because you would... and then the dividends, or the money that would come, as it does come normally to the very wealthy now, who accumulate increased income by ownership of technology, would be vouched
Then
to the general
distributed.
society as a way of distributing something above normal necessity, as
Yes,
it were, beyond need.
exactly.
Marx used to say distribute according to need. This would be distributing according to wants or proclivities.
No,
or
this
something.
will be distributing according to your productivity.
According to your productivity.
So you have a minimum wage satisfying your minimum needs, and then the dividends are distributed among workers in accordance with your productivity. So it will not cut down the incentive. It will lead to people will work very hard in order to share in that dividend, or in order to have a good share of the profit.
Oh, you think they would do that? So then, in a certain sense, that attitude of working very hard in order to have a good share of the dividend, that is not in and of itself a certain kind of materialistic striving or greed or something of that sort in and of itself?
Well, we are not going to outlaw greed.
No, we're not going to outlaw greed.
We are going to channel it in such a way that the economy functions smoothly.
You would channel the greed, and it's not, when we go back again to the cycles, Mr. Sakar and so we're talking about human nature, it's not the fact that human nature has built into it a factor that is greedy that we're trying to deal with. We're trying to find a channel for that
That's right.
greed as you see it.
Exactly.
Right? That kind of thing. So it's not the greed in and of itself, it's the misapplication of greed.
Or it's the wrong, bad institutions in society which let the greed express itself in an unlimited way.
In an unlimited way.
And which creates a tremendous imbalance in the economy and leads to depressions and so on.
And the people who argue that if you're going to let, there's a stock market firm now that says let no boundaries be known, or there's no boundaries, and that kind of thinking is going to lead inevitably to concentration of
That's totally foolish idea
wealth.
that stock market will keep rising every year. Whatever rises too fast always comes down fast also. So it is impossible. That's what people said in the 1920s, and then they had the 1930s depression. That's what people said in the 1860s, and then they had the depression of the 1870s.
I presume you're pleased now because you have this, that your book, if I may say so, is doing very, very well now. I mean,
Yes.
it's becoming a full-blown bestseller here in the United States. Tremendous attention being given to it by serious economists and so forth. I suppose that's pleasing to you because attention is being given to these issues.
Yes, attention is being given, and the more attention is focused on on this issue, the better chance we have of stopping the depression.
You still feel, even though the title of the book, if I may, is Why It's Got to Happen, and in Mr. Sakar's thinking and yours, there is a historiography that is beyond our human, there is a as you call it, deterministic view
Yes.
of history and so forth. But you do think there's a possibility for us to intervene so that it don't gotta happen, possibly?
Yes,
if we
it don't
could
got to
intervene in
happen,
turn.
yes.
The title of the book is Why It's Got to Happen. But do you
Well,
understand there's a little
the reason I
difference,
say that is
particularly
because,
when you have a deterministic view of history.
well, the reason I say why it got to happen is because it is going to take a tremendous grassroots movement to stop it. Once we can build on that grassroots movement, we can stop the depression. And frankly speaking, I am surprised at the amount of attention this book is getting myself. That's why I'm more optimistic now. When I was writing the book, I was very pessimistic at that time. I didn't know that people would pay this much attention.
I wonder if we could go through again and say institution. It would seem to me, and what you're saying, that of course, it's more complicated. People are the book is recommended to people to read in detail and so forth. But in general, you would seem to think that the major thrust that we have is to have an institutional approach to a way in which there can be a lessening of the concentration of ownership among a small group of people. Institutional means for doing that. You've mentioned 2 or 3 times here the employee stock ownership plan as one device.
And the 5%, average 5% wealth tax as the other device.
As a the 5% wealth tax. Has that been seriously proposed, the 5% wealth tax? By whom and who do we have lining up behind that within the Senate and the House? And realistic structure. I mean, the ESOP, Employee Stock Ownership Plan, has a considerable constituency within the Congress and so forth. It's got a track record and it's running. It's a way to be followed. But the 5% wealth tax, are there a major lineup? Are any of the presidential candidates addressing these issues?
Not yet. Not yet. I think Gary Hart was going to talk about some kind of wealth tax on the rich, but then he has dropped out. So I hope that some other Democratic candidate comes along and starts talking about these issues.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if there could be, rather than a wealth tax on the rich, there might be able to be an emphasis upon bringing ownership to the underclasses in a way of seeing where maybe it would be if we've reached a certain point where we could bring the have-nots up rather than having to bring the haves down.
Yeah, see, that's what they have done.
That would be a philosophy that people of responsible persuasion in both of the Republican and Democratic Party or those elements might be able to encourage.
Well, see, the Reaganomics is called trickle-down economics.
Yeah, but it hasn't trickled down.
Right, and I would like to have a trickle-up economics, where the standard of living at the bottom starts rising first and then goes to the top. So trickle-up economics is far safer than a trickle-down economics, which hasn't worked in the 80s. Okay,
well, listen, we go on talking about 16 hours easily. It's an incredibly exciting proposition that you put before the Western world, as it were, in the United States. I mean, I just really thank you very much for all your work over the years, and congratulate you on that, and thank you very much certainly for participating here in Conversations. I would like to remind you in the television viewing audience again, the book is called The Great Depression of 1990, bestseller. Has a foreword by Lester Thoreau and comments by Mr. Leonard Silk and others, written by our author, our guest, Dr. Ravi Batra. Happy to be able to bring you those perceptions. We in Conversations invite you to tune in again next week. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for this particular segment. We'll see you next week. Dr. Batra, Ravi, if I may.
Yes.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Good night. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.